So it's almost the weekend, and Michelle and I have been talking about renting side-by-sides, or a side-by-side, to go travel the Black Hills in. And there's one in Custer that rents places, and so we were thinking we might go rent for a half a day and drive around. It's one of my favorite types of exploration to do. Michelle's idea of de-stressing is exercise. My idea of de-stressing is getting in a vehicle and driving and seeing things. They don't really mesh very well. So she has to suffer through, although she does enjoy and she's excited about the side-by-side as well. So it should be interesting tomorrow.
That's exciting.
Yep. And if I really get bored or tired of it, I just get off and walk alongside for a while or jog.
I won't come back and pick you up.
That's true.
Where's Michelle? Michelle, I need to track your location at all times.
Welcome to the Rekindle XM podcast, where today we'll be continuing our discussion on stress, burnout, and the impacts it has in our lives. I'm Brian. I'm the host today, and with me are Michelle and Masha. So last time we discussed the overall idea of stress, how it impacts us. We talked about the different environments that we see it, so the work environment, just overall outside of work environment, and the various relationships that we come across in our lives. And we also talked about how stress affects the body both mentally and physically, and how that stress response works. And lastly, we were starting to cover the stress cycle. And at the end of the stress cycle, both Michelle and Masha were trying to tell me that the stress cycle never really ends. And this is the perfect lead in to our next topic. So today we want to continue that discussion. And so the first topic is, what happens when the stress cycle doesn't end?
Nothing good.
But do you realize it?
And I think actually what we were talking about at the end of our last podcast was the individual stress cycle for one stressor might end, but the problem we often face is that the stressors come crashing in on us wave after wave, and we can't finish one before the next one starts. So I think that's actually what Masha and I were talking about, is just that if only it were one stress at a time, life would be good, but that's often not the way it goes.
Yes, I'm looking at it from a single parent perspective, and you work all day, you hurry up to pick up your kids from after school camp, wherever they are. You hurry home and you make dinner. By the time that's all done, it's 8 o'clock, and you have routine after routine after routine. And when you're done with that, you're just done with the day, and then you are stuck with household work. So that's the perspective I've come to. If you are a runner and if you have that window to distress in between something hectic that's going on throughout the day, that's a good way to end a stress cycle in the gym or whatever physical activity that you relate to, right? But if you don't have that, you have that stress cycle that doesn't end in a day. You may not get a good night's sleep, and then tomorrow it's all over again. And it's like that 5 days a week, maybe more. Then you have a weekend to recover. And during the weekend, you may or may not end a stress cycle. And it just builds on and builds on and builds on. And so what? You take a vacation, and that's when your stress cycle probably won't end either, because at that time, you're already in a long stress response cycle. That's my experience.
I was almost going to say over dramatic, but if it's your experience, I can't really say anything about that, can I?
No,
I agree
single
with
parent
her.
life.
And I'm not a single parent, but I do agree with her. And in fact, I found an article that talks about these daily routine stressors where it's just kind of, we run from one thing to the next, and we either don't take time, and I'm going to say that's probably it. We don't take the time to stop in between, and so they just kind of build up one thing after another until we crash into bed, and then we get up and we do it again. And it does feel like that is a continual cycle that particularly we as Americans are prone to.
Okay, I understand what you guys are saying, and I've definitely experienced that myself. But we need to bring it down to there are certain stressors that may not end. Not once. You're basically kind of saying one stress begins before another stress ends, and you never have a chance to completely get out of the stress cycles. But that's not what we're really trying to talk about right now. What we're trying to talk about is when there's a specific stress in our life that doesn't end.
Yes. So I think you're right. There is a distinction. We have all of these stressors. They're relatively small when taken one at a time, and then they do kind of pile up through the day. But what you're talking about is big stressors that go on for a long period. So according to Medline Plus, this is a stress that lasts for weeks, months, or longer. So you're right. There's
Divorce.
A distinction between that. Absolutely. That's at least months, if not years.
Months in a good case until they turn 18 and beyond in the worst case. I happen to be the lucky one.
Well, it's one of those stress isn't, I mean, divorce isn't just a stress, it's a trauma. So even though you start to move on from that stress and you can kind of close the cycle, you don't ever really move on from it because you always go back to it in your mind, whether you want to or not at times. And it just will work on you again. You can finally get to a point, I think, after time. I don't know why I'm speaking to this like I know it because I haven't been divorced, but I'm just thinking about it in generalities where
Parents are.
I'm just thinking about it how in other aspects where I've had significant trauma that, well, okay, let me speak to it as a child that their parents were divorced in their 20s. So I was in my 20s when my parents divorced, and it took me 10 years to get over that and rekindle relationships with my mom to a point where we have a decent relationship again. So that takes time, and it definitely is a single stress. I can't say that that situation caused me stress for 10 years, but it definitely caused me stress for the short term as well because I was living with my dad at the time that the divorce happened. So then I had to live through that as well. And that was very stressful. So, yes. So when we think about stress and the stress cycle and how it should be ending quickly, but then we look at the stress that doesn't end quickly, we can kind of label those as two different types of stress. So you have short-term stress and you have long-term stress. When does the stress turn from short-term to long-term? Is there a clear definition on that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because so Medline Plus is, a very well-known place to get medical information, and it's a trusted source. But even they said, well, it could be weeks, months, or longer. So that indicates that there is not a strict definition of when short-term becomes long-term. I think to some extent that's part of the problem is that we don't realize when stress has become long-term.
I think one thing to consider is in a perfect world, you have your short-term stress and it takes a week, a month to cycle, and then you have another short-term stress that cycles, right? In reality, it's layer. stress, short stress, and it just keeps going, right? And definition of long-term stress is when you can't add the short-term stress cycle, and it layers over into eventually long-term stress. You never fully recover from it. And I've had an experience in 2019 where my daughter was going through significant GI issues, and she ended up being hospitalized. And that event triggered a stress response to the point where any sort of anxiety would cause significant pain in her gut, any sort of anxiety or stress. And part of the treatment was to go gluten-free, lactose-free, to go all organic, and to get rid of all the sugar to help with inflammation and get her gut, restore her gut back to health through supplements and probiotics and prebiotics and etc. For her, that was a significant trauma that she's still going through. It's an event that happened in the past. It's going on 3 years almost that it happened. But every time she looks at what she can't eat, it triggers a response of, but I want to. It doesn't impact me anymore. I can totally have gluten. I can totally have sugar. And then it shows up again, right, as a physical symptom. And then she goes, okay, yep, I can have this, but I can still have this, right? It's this ongoing tug of war that's going into a long stress for her, where it should have been, short-term stress. You have a problem, you fix it, you move on. But it's kind of not really.
So you talked about layers again. So are you wanting to define long-term stress as not just one stress that's long-term, like divorce or somebody dying in the family, but it can also be long-term stress if you have multiple short-term stresses that you can't seem to get rid of? Are you suggesting that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't think we can rule it out, because that's experience for many people.
Yes, and I think that sometimes it's a mix. I mean, that's real life, right? Usually you have things that are going on for longer periods, and then on top of that you have the short-term stress. And if we go back to what we talked about last week, which is that stress bucket, you can kind of see how, yep, it's filling up with both of these types of stress.
Yes. Okay. Trying to think about where I want to take this now.
So we've talked about the long-term stress.
I know where I want to go.
I think our bodies are resilient in a sense that if we allow our bodies to rest, the time to heal, the cycle can end. And that healing usually happens during sleep. Our bodies fully restore, or should fully restore, during a good night's sleep. So what happens during short-term stress that turns into long-term stress? You lose the ability to have a good night's sleep. And that cycle of restoration that is essential for our well-being is interrupted. And if that cycle is interrupted, then you continue to layer on another stressor that you just can't keep up. Your body cannot keep up with healing itself because it's constantly under stress or under perceived stress. It could be a stressor that has happened weeks or months ago, but you're still taking it forward in a sense of thinking about it and replaying the scenario, and either living in regret, that's depression, or living in anticipated conversation that you may never have, that's anxiety, right? And if we fall into that trick, into that pattern, we're just on a very slippery slope of having challenges to recover on our own without help.
So I'm going to start to kind of disagree with you a little bit on whether short-term stress multiplied equals long-term stress, because there has to be, it's not really short-term anymore if it gets multiplied to the point where it's long-term. You have to be able to end those stress cycles. Otherwise, you can't call it short-term. Even if it piles on top of each other, like you're saying, those stress cycles have to end Otherwise, you just have long-term stress after long-term stress after long-term stress. So I'm not fully on page with you there. I guess that could be something we can talk about later. But to
I'm saying, go on.
So I want to start bringing them short-term stress versus long-term stress from a different angle. So if you think of stress as a board sitting on a fulcrum, so you have a board that goes like this.
A seesaw.
Seesaw, yes. And stress hits. So you have a stress hits and you start tipping down. With short-term stress, when you end that cycle, the stress comes back, or the board comes back to normal. So this is what we've been calling homeostasis. But as we start to enter long-term stress, when that goes down, our body can't deal with the stress as much as we could before, and that's where that short-term stress gets layered onto the long-term stress. But you have to have that long-term stress there first. So it tips down, but then your body stabilizes because it wants to be at normal, but it's no longer here, it's here. So each time that ball dips that seesaw down in a long-term stress situation, your teeth, you just start, it's a step process down to where eventually your body can't even function from the stress.
Well, and I see where you're headed with that, and I think that's actually what we see. So if you have long-term stress going on, but then there's a major short-term stress, and here's a couple stories of what I've heard. So let's say you have a fairly demanding career. Maybe you are a single mom, so you don't have a lot of margin in your life. The typical American life is just busy. But then all of a sudden, so you've got these longer term stresses of, let's say, a demanding career, you're a single mom, but then you throw a pretty major short term stress onto that. Let's say there's a health crisis that is short term, but if you're already dealing with long term stress, that could be the thing that kind of tips you over into an unhealthy state.
Yes, I can agree with that.
Yeah, and all I'm saying, Brian, I'm not disagreeing with you. All I'm saying is that when you are on the down of the jigsaw and your short stress is supposed to end, but it doesn't, right? And then you have the next short-term stress that's already on the downhill slope, step down, and you just don't have the ability or the time necessary to recoup from it. And that's what I'm calling that layer of short stress over short stress, because the short stress cycle should end. But my argument is, does it?
Then it no longer becomes short term, is what I'm saying.
Exactly. And that's your segue into long term.
Right. You can't just have a short-term stress that doesn't end to another short-term stress that doesn't end to another short-term stress that doesn't end. Otherwise, none of those are short-term stresses. If they don't have an end, they have to have an end. So I don't disagree with you on the fact that short-term stress can add on to the long-term stress that you're feeling, but there has to be an end to the cycle for it to be a short-term stress.
So there's got to be intentionality to end the short-term stress, right? And that's taking the time and the coping skills necessary to end the stress cycle. And
at some point, yes, people need to get there, but
because it doesn't just end on its own. It doesn't just magically go away. I mean, it could, but I don't see it.
People you may not realize it because you're just naturally ending it without thinking about it. So you're getting deeper into the conversation than I was intending for this topic. And I don't disagree with you.
Wait.
There comes a point when you have to have intentionality in getting rid of that stress. But right now we're just trying to define what long-term stress is.
So in this example, short-term stress. I'm driving on a road and somebody cuts me off and I am pissed off for a minute and then I get over it and I forget about it. I move on. So that type of stress is what we're talking about as short-term stress.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And you're definitely automatically coping with that in most cases and just getting rid of it.
That's true. Okay. I can totally see that.
Or I have a deadline coming up in a month, so I'm stressed out 2 weeks before because I'm not as close as I want to be, and then I'm really stressed out by the deadline. That's not a long-term stress. It's not necessarily short term, but it's still a short-term stress because once the deadline is completed, the stress starts to go away.
Okay. And that's exactly what I mean by, the jigsawing down when you have that longer short-term stress that you're going into a month, and that stress can easily layer over itself because you may have new stressors that come up. Okay.
I get
So
where
we
you're
have
going
different
with
scenarios.
that.
Yep.
We weren't necessarily arguing that what you're saying is wrong. What I'm arguing is that all that does is compile onto the long-term stress and add to your stress. It's not really a long-term stress. There has to be a long-term
Agree.
stress for the multiple short-term stresses to have any real effect on it because those end at some point. So when we start to look at long-term stress and then we start to look at burnout, when does long-term stress become burnout? That one's just as hard to define as short-term to long-term.
It is. I was actually thinking about the stress bucket, and if we kind of think about the stress bucket, what's going to happen when it gets too full? Like for example, if you have a bunch of small stresses and you've got kind of the stress bucket, you've got spigots on the bottom where the stress is coming out, you're coping with it, you're ending the cycle. The small stresses are going to go in, and you're pretty much going to, for the most part, be able to
they're going to go
pour those out in pour them out, in small amounts. You've got a small river of stress coming out that you're continually dealing with. It's not causing you problems. But when that stress bucket gets so full because you've got long-term stress in it, and that's just kind of adding on, and then you've got the normal daily short-term stress, eventually that bucket's just going to tip over. And I kind of think of it as, okay, if you have, a dam that's holding back water, in this case, you got a bucket, people can deal with the river, but when the dam goes, it washes away everything and just causes complete destruction. So I think of it as that burnout is the result of too much stress that has now tipped the bucket.
You know what comes to mind in water world and images? You have this water park and kids wait under this bucket that's filling in with water, and you just stand underneath it and it just dumps on you.
Totally.
Okay. I get what you're saying. That is the result of burnout, but I feel like burnout starts. That's just the end result that we're willing to recognize. So I think it starts sooner than that. And it's definitely during long-term stress and not short-term stress. So we never seem to realize it until the end result is not what we want. So let's go back and think about maybe where we can start defining when burnout starts. So when you hit long-term stress, can you basically say that's the start of your burnout, or do you think it goes a little farther in that?
It's a good question. When I think back to where I started to have a recognition that there was too much stress in my life. So, Brian, you and I had just gotten married. I was finishing up my master's degree, which meant I was writing an article and trying to get it published. And then I was working more than full time, so probably 45 hours a week just on the work job. We had bought an older house that needed a bunch of renovating, and we had family situation, social. We had a lot going on outside of that. I knew I was stressed. I could tell I was getting stressed by everything that was going on, but I didn't actually realize that it was too much until it was too late. Exactly what you said, because I started having problems. My stomach started hurting. I was diagnosed with ulcers and put on, antacids, etc. Um, that was the point at which I realized that I actually had too much stress. I don't know if I would have recognized it before then, to be honest.
Well, I know. I
I
think
have
that's the problem, is that people don't recognize it.
I can see where I should have recognized it. So 2 years before my health crisis, about 2 years, like right on the dot, about 2 years, my stress coping mechanism was massages. I used to get them when I felt the stress, my muscles would tense up. I would become like a flex board instantly. And I knew that it's okay. It's time. My body showed me that it's time to go and get a deep tissue massage. And I wasn't just getting, your Swedish back rub. I was getting like sports medicine. It's like torture. And then after that, it hurts more for a couple of minutes or a couple of days, and you feel better. Like you feel physical release from the massage, sports massage. And right around 2 years beforehand, and I've been doing massage therapy for goodness decades, and every single time it worked for me. There's that one time it stopped working for me. I came in about a little bit more hurt than I usually am. I had more knots, I had more tension than I usually had. I walked out of it, massage, and all of my muscles locked up more. So instead of getting released, I got more stiff. So it took me about 3 weeks to fully recover from that, where, the after effects of massage, it was pretty traumatic. And that's when I stopped them. It should have been an indicator, right? That was a physical indicator. Another indicator was I met my therapist right around that time. It was just, it's funny how God works, right? He'll send you like older messaging, and I just like completely blow past them and ignore them. I meet my therapist, and I asked this woman, like we totally bonded, we totally clicked, we got along just fine. We had the same language, there was synergy there. And I asked what she does, and she says, I'm a therapist. I'm like, oh. I was just dumbfounded. I'm like, oh, I had negative stigma about getting therapy, but at that point I was beginning to come open to it. And there she was right in front of me. So I got her card, did not call her 2 years later when I actually had the health crisis, right? She was right before me. I could have caught and changed my behaviors, my patterns. I had recognition, awareness, accountability, better coping skills. I could have walked away better prepared and better coping with my burnout versus completely falling into a health crisis and having to deal with it then all at once. But I already knew the person I'd be working with. I just did not utilize her when God sent her to me. So there's 2 instances of me being already in burnout and completely ignoring it and still being busy with life and responding to everything, right? Keep stacking my layers of burnout until I physically could not take them on anymore. My body said, oh, you're done.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is usually the story, because we've talked to several people who've gone through burnout, and usually what ends up happening is they do have long-term stress going on. They've got short-term stress going on. They know they're stressed, but they don't realize how much stress until they end up in the hospital, not able to get out of bed, or they get up one morning and their mental and cognitive symptoms are so bad they literally can't do their work. So that's usually what happens. And I think one of the things that we do is that we sort of compartmentalize our life. So I knew, in my situation, I knew I was working overtime, and then I was putting in probably another part-time job trying to get my master's thesis and publishable paper done, new house, new marriage. These were all things that you look at and you're like, well, those are, of course, going to cause some kind of stress. But I compartmentalized them. I said, well, I'm only working 45 hours a week. That's not that much more. Yeah, I'm working on my thesis, but this is a short term, I'll get through this. Yes, I'm working on my house and doing, all these renovations, but everybody does that. So you look at them all individually as different areas. You don't put them together and realize, oh my goodness, overall, I've got way too much stress when I start to look at my entire life.
I completely agree with you because when my therapist first asked me first session, how are you? How are you? And I'm like, what do you mean, how am I? Like, which section, which category of me? So totally relate. We started with one section, was one compartment, but I was like, okay, well, how am I at work? How am I personally? How is my health? I'm like, it's all just down in the gutter at this point, right? So, but one thing I do appreciate about my daughter, when I asked her, well, how are you? She asked me, well, what do you mean, physically or mentally? And I'm like, oh, interesting. I do the same thing. Tell me more, right? But it wasn't, it was before my burnout, but it's something I realized I do too. And I think you're right. Many of us do compartmentalize our burdens, which makes it more tolerable. It makes it more invisible. It makes it more out of sight. And it gives us false perception that we still have fuel left to keep going.
Well, I think burnout still has a negative connotation. So people aren't going to be as willing to admit it because of that. It has a stigma to it.
Or you don't even know what it is. I had never heard that term when I started having those symptoms. I couldn't have put a label on it if I had tried because that term was not being used widely.
Well, yes, but I mean, if you start talking about it to your friends and coworkers, they're not going to necessarily treat that in a good light, and that may cause even more stress by the time you're done. But
true, especially in the corporate world. I mean, you're not going to come to your work and say, I'm burned out. I need a leave of absence. Excuse me.
Right.
Bye. I'll come back when I feel better. Right? It's not what's happening out there in the world. Although it probably should. I mean, we're supposed to have mental health days, right? But are you going to go to your manager and say, hey, I need a mental health day. I just can't make it through today without blowing up in someone's face?
There was plenty of times. There was plenty of times where I've called in and said, mental health days.
Did you say specifically, manager, I need a mental health day today, therefore I'm not coming in?
Yes.
Okay.
It's your PTO.
Okay.
The PTO is now PTO and medical leave, so it's like it's your time.
But I will say a lot of people don't have that freedom or don't feel they have that freedom, even if they have PTO stacked up.
The difference is I was in burnout during that time, so I spent all my vacation almost as soon as I got it.
Yes.
Because my proclivity to be at work was less than my need to be there. So
which drove me nuts, by the way, because I had weeks of vacation.
There's no way I could ever compete with that. She had like 10 days of vacation, a paycheck.
No.
It was over 8. It was 8 or 9.
8 or 9 hours, yeah.
Yes, 8 or 9.
Yeah.
No, it was 10 hours. It was 10 hours of paycheck. So she was getting almost a day and a half of paycheck. There's no way that 3 weeks, people that are getting 3 weeks of paycheck, vacation a year can compete with that. So she always had too much vacation. But anyway,
squirrel.
Moving
so
on.
Is that a indicator? No. You said something, and just let me follow through. I know you're going to burst my bubble here, but hey, just hear me out. So is that a pre-indicator to managers that when your workforce is beginning to have zero PTO balance, that your workforce is burnt out?
It could be. I actually had an employee, so I was a supervisor for a while, and I did have an employee who had that situation. And then she was asking for, unpaid leave, and she'd been at the company for at least, I want to say, 10 years, which means she was getting pretty decent PTO at that point. It was at least, 8 hours per paycheck. And she never had PTO. We actually ended up letting that employee go. When I look back now, she was actually going through an incredibly stressful time that none of us knew about with her family situation. Her husband was addicted to opioids. She was trying to deal with that, raise a family, work full time. She had a 2-hour commute, and we all missed it.
That's unfortunate.
There's a lot of time that people just view that as you don't want to be there, not necessarily that it's burned out. So, I mean, it kind of goes to you're either heading towards burnout or you really just don't like your job. So you can't necessarily just say anybody who doesn't ever have any PTO is burned out. So,
Right. But I do think it could be a possible indicator if there's other things going on.
I think that, yes, it should be something that should be managers should start paying attention to. But so we have our long-term burnout, and we also have our stress response. Is the stress response different for everyone? When we start looking at genetic disposition, and there's an article in the Mayo Clinic that's called Chronic Stress Puts Your Health at Risk. And it talks about a genetic predisposition to stress. So everybody at a gene level has a different stress response. So you have somebody that's always relaxed and you have somebody that's always wired. And then everybody else falls somewhere in between, and it's usually more in the middle. So most of us are in the middle of that genetic disposition. What do you guys think about that?
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think some people get fueled from stressful situations and they are more clear-minded, level-headed, and that's your short-term stress. And others can just, throw the keys at the boss and walk out, right? So different genetic makeup, similar situation, but two different outcomes. So I think you're completely right. There's different coping mechanisms, and some people can take a deep breath and evaluate the situation and properly respond to the situation. Others just react to the situation. But then there's also a response that is non-emotional, non-mental. There's physical response, right? So if you get that email and then you're instantly in pain because cortisol release triggered a chemical reaction, and you're so sensitive at that point that you instantly get gut aches. So you instantly get ill. So it could be also a sign of long-term stress. So Michelle, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was thinking about the different types of careers. So I wanted to be a doctor growing up. I went to pre-med. That was my degree in college. And after college, I had applied, I was still applying. I was getting interviews. But somewhere along that road, I actually realized that there was no way genetically, whatever. I did not have what it took to get through that stress of med school, internship, and residency. And part of the reason I knew that is because in my junior year, which if you're a pre-med major, your junior year is crazy because you've got to take the MCATs, which means, not only are you taking the high level science classes at that point, and, you're studying all the time anyway, but then you're studying for the MCATs. So I'd get up at 5:30 in the morning, I'd go to school, I'd do my regular studies, and then from 11 to midnight, I'd stay up and study every night for months. I got so sick that year that I actually ended up in the university hospital with a white cell count that was so low they wouldn't release me for like 3 days. So I just came to this point, was like, I love medicine, I love science, but I just don't have what it takes to make it through the stress of med school, internship, and residency. So that's my personal example.
So in the stress response, and Masha started covering it a little bit with what she was saying with her stomach aches. The Mayo Clinic also starts to talk about how previous life experience and those type of events, and some of them can be traumatic, affects how our stress response is today. So people that were in extremely stressful situations are more likely to have a quick stress response to new situations versus people that have not had those types of experiences. What do you think? We've kind of already got one story off of that, but
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Brian, you and I, so we went through the foster care classes. We at one point in our life we were planning to adopt foster children, and as you go through those classes, you pretty quickly realize that a lot of children in the foster care system do have these very quick and very intense stress responses because of what they went through, whatever that situation is that landed them in foster care. So that's just one example.
that's a really good example.
Wow, that is.
So the article goes on to say there are 9 effects that long-term stress and burnout can have on you. And the 9 different effects are anxiety, which we've kind of talked about, and a depression, digestive problems, headaches, muscle tension and pain, heart disease and heart-related issues, sleep problems, weight gain, memory and concentration impairment. And I think in the last 2 discussions that we've had between last episode and today, we have covered every one of those points with one story or another. So
yeah, it's interesting because I think between the three of us, so you have the three of us who've all been through burnout, and you're right, I think we've covered that list. We all had different symptoms, but between the three of us, we've had all of them to some extent.
Yeah, it's so alarming that I've suffered 9 of those symptoms. And what was alarming to me is that in my primary care, nobody connected the dots, right? If you think about, you go to your doctor and you have a symptom you want to discuss, the major complaint, but there's so many, how do I pick, right? Well, the most important one right now is like my head hurts. I cannot think. Nothing's helping. But then there's also GI problems. Well, wait, before we go into GI, we need to talk about the headache. 20 minutes is up. See you next time. It's like, wait, what? And then I have to wait another 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 weeks, whatever the access issues are, to talk about the GI problems. It's like, that is not sustainable care. And we have a population that is unaware of burnout symptoms, and they present to their care physicians with a single symptom when they have a laundry basket of symptoms to discuss. And that physician is ill-informed to draw a conclusion. I'm not talking, poorly about our medical system. I mean, it is very much stressed, and we do need significant attention there. But what the lesson I've learned from suffering and surviving burnout is that I had to manage my own care. I had to connect the dots. I had to present evidence to my physicians and say, here is the big picture of everything that's going on. Here's what I think it is. And we were more prompt to solutioning versus going through every single symptom, which is addressed, majority of it is addressed in a different specialty line. So you go to one doctor who refers you to another specialty, who refers you to a different specialty. And by the time you're done visiting all the specialties, you have months of untreated symptoms that is just taking you further and further into burnout. I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, you're right. And in the meantime, here's my question. How many times did a doctor ask you about your stress level?
Once.
And was that your primary care? Which doctor was it that finally asked you?
My naturopathic a doctor, a physician who practices medicine every day and decided that Western medicine is actually doing more harm than good. and combining Western medicine practices with Eastern medicine and wisdom and practices, and looks at your whole body, all of the symptoms, to try to understand what is causing it and treating the cause, the root cause of the problem. In my mind, in my opinion, it makes the most sense. Let's not treat the puzzle. Let's treat the entire big picture. And that's what I finally, once I got there, my recovery started very, very quickly. Getting there was the problem, and it took months.
Yes, and I think, you're right. The way that our medical system is set up, the systems, people don't often think, especially, physicians don't, but we don't either. The people going in, we often don't think about stress as being the cause of a whole lot of other things. I actually got really interested in this topic back in when I was working on my master's degree in public health, because research was starting to come out about stress and working women. And the research has continued. Now I'm seeing the new research coming out on burnout. I think we're actually still pretty early, but I'm going to bet that at some point, just like we have metabolic syndrome, I bet we're going to end up with some kind of burnout syndrome. I could be wrong, so we'll see. Ask me in 10 years.
There will be a diagnosis and there will be a treatment protocol for it, because with the staggering numbers we're seeing of burnout in different work sectors, our entire workforce is at risk of burnout. And we're thinking about, okay, overwhelming our healthcare, hospital systems, and et cetera. That could be something that's really going to overwhelm them if people start crashing all at once. And recently we had a business owner, a friend, who's a team of one, makes really great money, really high intense overachiever, really healthy guy, like in his late 50s. Like, you look at him, he looks young, he looks healthy, he's a runner, he's very ambitious. He's crashed in the hospital. And we're like, what happened? It's like, I went in with a cardiovascular symptoms thinking I'm having a heart attack. It comes out his symptom is fibromyalgia due to stress. It's like, okay, dude. So 3 months of recovery from fibromyalgia, he's still having significant pain and lifestyle adjustments that he had to deal with. But he had to take all that time off work. And this is the man who powered through and worked through vacation, took his laptop, took care of customers, made good money, has a really nice house and a really nice lifestyle. But heck, he just lost his health from what? Going to heart for too long?
Oh, there's so much to talk about in burnout.
we just
we all know somebody.
The top of that bucket, right?
Totally. I bet you every single person, every listener knows somebody who has gone through significant stress, who is experiencing long-term effects of burnout, and they have possibly significant health complications.
I agree.
So as we think about burnout and where it comes from and the stress cycle and how we want to end the stress cycle, even if it's long-term, we got to find a way to end that long-term stress cycle. There's a lot to consider and a lot to dig into and investigate. But that's for another time. So join us next time as we discuss quiet quitting.
All right.